Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I will be doing our third lecture of the semester, which will be on the Chinese traditions, Confucianism, and Daoism. But before I get into the content, I would like to remind you that you should read your textbook's third chapter before engaging with this lecture. First in this lecture, we will take a look at the period of Chinese history associated with the Zhou dynasty, the longest dynasty of Chinese history that lasted 800 years, from 1046 to 256 BCE. This period is significant because it was when many influential Chinese philosophers lived, including Confucius, Chuang-Tzu, and supposedly the mythical Lao Tzu. Then we will examine the lasting influence these two traditions have had on Chinese, Korean, and Japanese culture. And lastly, we will learn about the presence of Confucian and Taoist philosophy in America and in well-known popular media. Okay, so as you should already know if you read our third chapter, Confucianism is a tradition that developed around the life and teachings of a man named Confucius, who we know by the name Confucius, a politician and teacher from ancient China. Taoism, as you also should already know, is a tradition that developed around the mythical figure Lao Tzu and the text that is attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, and the slightly younger historical figure Chuang-Tzu and his appropriately named work, the Chuang-Tzu. All of these men, Confucius, Lao Tzu, and Chuang-Tzu, all of them came from the Zhou dynasty. As I previously mentioned, the Zhou dynasty is the longest period of Chinese history. The Zhou dynasty is traditionally divided into two periods. First is the Western Zhou, and then comes the Eastern Zhou. The beginning of the Western Zhou was marked by the fall of the Shang dynasty after the defeat of King Zhou of Shang at the Battle of Muyi. If you briefly take a look at our map, you can see on the top we have the geography of the Western Zhou, and then on the bottom we have the geography of the Eastern Zhou. As I just said, it was at the Battle of Muyi that the first king of Zhou, King Wu of Zhou, defeated King Zhou of Shang and captured the city of Yin. Thus formally ending the Shang period and formally beginning the Zhou period, specifically the Western Zhou period. The official first king of the Zhou period was King Wen, but he was given this title posthumously. As I mentioned, it was his son, King Wu, that would become the first living king of the Zhou dynasty by defeating the Shang emperor in battle. But then he would die 2 years later. It was Wu's son Cheng who would become the next king of the Western Zhou, but he was only a child, so it was his uncle, the Duke of Zhou, who acted as regent to the Western Zhou kingdom until Cheng was old enough to actively rule. The Duke of Zhou was a very influential figure in Chinese history, being credited with some major aspects of Chinese religion that would be influential on people like Confucius. Firstly, the Duke of Zhou established what is known as the Fangjian system of government, one akin to that of feudal medieval Europe, in that it consisted of a ruling noble class that was given land by the king in various amounts depending on their social rank, and the common people would live and work on the land of one of these noble families. This system of government is significant because it would create the necessary conditions for what comes in the Eastern Zhou period, which we will discuss later on. The Duke of Zhou is also one of the figures traditionally attributed with writing the I Ching, also called the Book of Changes, one of the 5 Chinese classics that Confucius would have studied to develop his ideology, and that is mentioned in your textbook. Additionally, the Duke of Zhou is also one of the figures credited with explaining the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven was first introduced in the Western Zhou period and gave the new Zhou rulers divine right to rule over their Shang predecessors that still wanted to regain power. But their rule would come to an end when the Zhou Emperor Yu was defeated in 1771 BCE, marking the end of the Western Zhou and beginning of the Eastern Zhou. The Eastern Zhou period officially began when the capital was moved east to the ancient city of Luoyang. The Eastern Zhou period is divided into two eras, the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. At the beginning of the Spring and Autumn period, the Eastern Zhou dynasty was divided into 15 major mini-states and many more smaller estates scattered between. At this point in the Zhou dynasty, the Zhou emperor held very little power, only controlling the land around the capital at Luoyang. The rest of the kingdom was, as I just mentioned, divided into many mini-states of various size controlled by different noble families. So, the government system that the Duke of Zhou initiated in the Western Zhou period, the lack of centralized power and the rising power of other noble families, would in fact sow the seeds for the many conflicts during the Eastern Zhou period. These constant conflicts would create the necessary social conditions for individuals like Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Chuang-Tzu to come up with their respective social philosophies. Confucius was a man from the Spring and Autumn period, and he was the illegitimate son of the ruler of Lu, one of the many small states in eastern China at the time. A politician and a teacher, Confucius sought an end to the constant conflict during the Eastern Zhou period, and the means he emphasized was a good ruler and educated subjects, a solution to government and human development. For Confucius, society needed clear-cut social roles with clear hierarchy and quality, reciprocal relationships between the various roles. According to Confucius, with this structure and open education for all, individuals would develop into good human beings. Confucius's most famous work is called the Analects, in which he has short dialogues with his students on a number of subjects. Confucius is one of the most famous and influential people who has ever lived, and his legacy still is impacting the world today. Lao Tzu, as we discussed earlier, is a semi-mythical figure, meaning a person named Lao Tzu may never have actually existed, and his most famous work, the Tao Te Ching, was most likely written by multiple people at different times. But for the sake of this lecture, we will suspend disbelief and pretend that he was a real person. Lao Tzu would have lived right before Confucius, and similarly had ideas about how people should live and how rulers should rule. For Lao Tzu, man should live in accordance with the way, or Tao, a way of living in accordance with nature. Of course, what is considered nature, or natural, is subjective, and in this case, nature is based on the cosmology of Daoism discussed in your textbook. Humans can become one with the Tao through Wu Wei, which I will discuss more after I introduce our other central figure in Taoism, Chuang-Tzu. The Warring States period began in about 475 BCE. The Warring States period is marked by, as you most likely can guess from its name, constant conflict amongst the various states in China. The result was the conquest of the Qin state over all the other states and the unification of China into the Qin dynasty. Chuang-Tzu, whose real name was Chuang-Zhou, was a man born during the Warring States period in China. Chuang-Tzu, like Confucius, was of lower aristocratic background and worked as a politician. He held a minor post in Meng. Chuang-Tzu's work focuses on happiness, personal ease and fulfillment, individual freedom, and generally the way to live your best life. For Chuangzi and for Taoists, the term for this way of action is Wu Wei. Wu Wei can be translated as no action, or trying without trying. A more detailed definition is a state of personal harmony in which actions flow freely from one's spontaneous inclinations without the need for extended deliberation or inner struggle. You may experience something along these lines doing something you're passionate about and love doing. This trying without trying was Lao Tzu's idea of a proper ruler, someone so in tune with nature that they could rule without ruling. The Eastern Zhou period of Chinese history would produce many famous and influential thinkers like the ones we just went over, Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Chuangzi, but also the creator of the art of war, Sun Tzu, Neo-Confucius like Mencius and Shunzi, and Moists like Mozi, to name a few. Due to the immense amount of new ideas and different schools of thought, this era would appropriately come to be known as the Hundred Schools of Thought. This period of Chinese history would have long-lasting influence over China and the rest of East Asia. Confucius and Taoist ideas and practices would spread out through East Asia from China to Korea and Japan and developed into a lasting influence on the culture of all three of these nations. In China, Daoism has been constantly influencing religion and culture since the Zhou dynasty. When Buddhism was introduced, for example, to China around the end of the Zhou dynasty, it was initially met by and interpreted by Taoists. Some scholars think this interaction between Taoism and Buddhism resulted in the initial creation of Chan Buddhism in China, or Zen Buddhism in Japan. Taoism has also been influential on Chinese medicine. Taoism places an emphasis on becoming immortal, which has historically resulted in an interest in preserving the body's health through the use of various plants, diets, and meditation. Another example of Taoist influence is architecture. In modern China, feng shui is still often used when building houses. Taoism is also still highly prevalent in its organized form in modern-day Taiwan, with the dominant lineage being the way of the celestial masters. Additionally, politicians will often appear at Taoist temples during their campaigns to speak. Confucianism had a huge impact on Chinese culture until the 20th century when there was a rise of anti-Confucius rhetoric. Then, China officially transitioned to communism in 1949, and Confucian ideas and practices were relegated to the background of society even more. Though, recently, Confucius ideas have seen a revival. That is not to say that they went away completely in China, more that they were repressed and are acknowledged more now. If you take a short look at our slide, you can see a Confucian temple on the left and a Taoist temple on the right. Historically, Korea has been highly influenced by China. Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism were all originally introduced to Korea from China. Each of these traditions had its time in favor of the ruling elite of Korea at different periods of the history of Korea. All three religions are still present in Korea today, with Confucianism and Buddhism being the most popular, but Taoist influence is still present. One of the most obvious examples of Taoist influence is South Korea's flag. As you can see, it has a yin-yang turned horizontal, with the colors changed from black and white to blue and red. Additionally, you can see the yin-yang is surrounded by 4 of the 8 trigrams. This symbol originated from the I Ching in the Zhou period. Confucianism, as I mentioned, has been influential in Korean history and on Korean culture. Neo-Confucianism was the official state religion of the Joseon dynasty in Korea, the last Korean dynasty that lasted for 5 centuries from the 14th to 19th century. Confucian ideas have faced criticism and decline in Korea since its transition to westernization, but still have had a lasting impact on the culture. If you take another short look at the slide, you can see again a Confucian temple on the left and a Taoist temple on the right. In Japan, Taoist influence is historically present through the tradition of On-myodo, or the way of the yin-yang. On-myodo is a system of natural science, astronomy, almanac, divination, and magic that developed based on yin-yang and five elements philosophy that originated in China. Today in Japan, there is a shrine in Kyoto dedicated to the most famous Onmyoji, Abe no Saimai. You can see a picture of this temple in the bottom right corner of the slide. Confucianism, on the other hand, would have spread to Japan as early as the Han Dynasty, which began around 50 years after the fall of the Zhou Dynasty, though many Confucian texts would make their way to Japan from Korea. Neo-Confucianism would be introduced to Japan in the Kamakura period, which ran from the 12th to 14th centuries, but would become popular when the shogunate would adopt it during the Tokugawa period, which lasted from the 17th to 19th centuries. Confucian philosophy would go on to be influential in the minds of influential figures in the Meiji Restoration, and still is today in modern Japanese philosophy. Again, if you want to take a quick look at the slide, on the left you have a temple of Confucius, and on the top right you have a Taoist temple. Eventually, through the interactions between the East and West, Taoist and Confucius ideas would make their way to America. Daoism is practiced in America with an estimated 30,000 Taoist practitioners living in the United States. Though their structure is highly decentralized, meaning they do not congregate often. Additionally, the practices of Taoist immigrants and those of Taoist converts differ. Taoist immigrants usually do not concern themselves with scriptures or individual practices and focus on important annual rituals and preserving their local traditions. Taoist converts, on the other hand, are not so worried with preserving tradition and will make no attempt to preserve things they find unfamiliar. There are also many people who are not necessarily Taoist, but are spiritual and may take an aspect of Taoism and incorporate it into their own practices. In San Francisco, for example, there is a Taoist temple that you can see here on your slide on the top right and bottom right. Confucianism, on the other hand, was first introduced to the United States when Christian missionaries traveled to China during the 19th century. Some of them, on their return to the U.S., spoke very highly of Confucius and his Analects. This would begin a tradition of American scholarship on Confucianism, resulting in the creation of a number of institutions devoted to the study of China and Confucianism in America and academia. For example, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard, which you can see a picture of on the bottom left, and their symbol on the top left. Elements of Confucian and Taoist philosophy have even made their way into popular American media. There are many examples of TV shows, movies, and books, all created by Americans, that contain elements of Confucian and Taoist philosophy, and ancient Chinese cosmology. One example is the movie Kung Fu Panda, particularly the scenes involving Master Wu Wei, who you can see in the bottom left of our slide. Another example is the animated television series Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is full of references to rituals and concepts associated with the Asian traditions, specifically Chinese concepts like yin and yang, qi, and many more subtle references to Chinese philosophy. If you look at the top right, you can see two koi fish from the Avatar series that are supposed to represent yin and yang. Additionally, characters in the super popular franchise Star Wars have also demonstrated an influence from Chinese philosophy, namely Yoda. There are also plenty of other examples, like kung fu movies that occasionally have elements of Chinese religion. If you are interested in kung fu movies, there is a new movie on Netflix called Paper Tigers, which is a kind of kung fu comedy movie with some good references to Chinese philosophy and religion. Next, we will take a brief look at a scene from Kung Fu Panda.
Shifu. There is just news. There is no good or bad.
Master, your vision was right. Tai Lung has broken out of prison. He's on his way.
That is bad news. If you do not believe that the Dragon Warrior can stop him.
The panda? Master, that panda is not the Dragon Warrior. He wasn't even meant to be here. It was an accident.
There are no accidents.
Yes, I know. You've said that already. Twice.
Well, that was no accident either.
Thrice.
My old friend, the panda will never fulfill his destiny, nor you yours, until you let go of the illusion of control.
Illusion?
Yes. Look at this tree, Shifu. I cannot make it blossom when it suits me, nor make it bear fruit before its time.
But there are things we can control. I can control when the fruit will fall. And I can control where to plant the seed. That is no illusion, Master.
Ah, yes. But no matter what you do, that seed will grow to be a peach tree. You may wish for an apple or an orange, but you will get a peach.
But a peach cannot defeat Tai Lung.
Maybe it can, if you are willing to guide it, to nurture it, to believe in it.
But how? How? I need your help, Master.
No, you just need to believe. Promise me, Shifu. Promise me you will believe.
I will try.
Good. My time has come. You must continue your journey without me.
What are you... What? Master! You can't leave me.
You must believe.
Master!
If we examine this scene and this conversation between Master Uwei and Master Sifu, there seems to be a difference in opinion. On one hand, we have Master Uwei, who, in my opinion, seems to represent the Taoists, and on the other hand, we have Master Sifu, who, in my opinion, seems to represent the Confucianists. Now we will briefly take a look at the concept syncretism. Syncretism is a word in your textbook, but actually isn't used until the Shintoism chapter, but I think it's very important to understanding Confucianism and Daoism, so I will touch on it briefly here. Key to understanding East Asian religion, and really religion in general, is to keep in mind the highly syncretic aspect of religion, and culture as a whole. Historically, new traditions are constantly being reinterpreted by old ones, and vice versa. So, in ancient East Asia, Taoism and Confucianism would have been interacting and mixing with each other, then with Buddhism, then would spread and mix with the indigenous religions of Korea and Japan. Eventually, these ideas would have made their way to America and have now influenced our culture in ways. These interactions where, as we discussed, the traditions like Neo-Confucianism, Chan/Zen Buddhism, and Onmyodo are created are the result of interactions between different traditions, different cultures at different times. They are the result of syncretism. Each of the countries we discussed today has a history of Confucian and Taoist growth, an influence that has resulted in at times subtle and at times obvious Confucian and Taoist ideas and practices. Of course, as we discussed earlier, these traditions that originated in the Zhou dynasty in China around 2,500 years ago were themselves rooted in an older Chinese cosmology, which can be learned about more in your textbook. That just about wraps up the content for this lecture. Make sure to do your discussion number 3, which your first post is due by Wednesday, September 22nd, and your replies are due Wednesday, September 29th. Also be sure to do quiz number 3 and test number 3, which are both due Wednesday, September 29th. The next module you guys will cover is the Hinduism module, which will open on Wednesday, September 29th, and will be run by Professor Pratt. Thank you all for joining me today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.